Hello, hello. I am making sure that I have a link and that this is going on YouTube right now. Let's see. Not quite yet. It's not showing yet. Let's reload the page again. I know, like, in theory it is. I just really need to make sure that it's capturing and that I have access to the chat. So give me a second here. Here we go. All right, let's learn game making. Let's indeed learn game making. I'm going to copy the link, put it in its relevant place. All right, cool. So I'm going to scroll down. I'm also going to make sure that I mute the YouTube. There we go. Okay. And now I will go down to the chat. All right, cool. So let me see. Is anybody on yet? It doesn't look like it. Oh, 5. Hello, 5. All right, so welcome to talking about level design. And so I'm doing this obviously for my game prototyping course. Thank you, everybody, for coming on. And what I am doing today is we were scheduled for a level design lecture, and I usually give a basic level design lecture, but we already did that several weeks ago because I recognized that there was like a more immediate need for some level design stuff. So I've prepared this new one that Gook. So if you're not one of my students and you find this video someday, this will not cover the entire disclaimer. This will not cover the entire book. So there's still a reason to go check the actual book out. But for those of you who are watching right now, FYI, I'm going to cover stuff from this text, and it is available in our library as far as I know. So let's get started. So a lot of people hear theory and they think like, oh no, none of these are actually going to be useful. And that's true for a lot of, I think, studies area theory. I've certainly read some game studies, for example, and not to knock game studies, but like I've certainly read some game studies that will never help me make a game. Like people always cite like Johann Huizinga and his some of his like discussions of the part of play in human society. Like I've read that. It's never made me a better game designer. But I do think that architectural theory has made me a better game designer. And the reason why is that architectural theory is applicable. It's highly applicable. So here's a screenshot from a really great architecture blog called McMansion Hell, and it's really fun. It's snarky, but it gives a pretty good write-up of what architecture theory is. And architecture theory is really based on the actual built environment in real space, dealing with real people's lives and how those spaces affect people's lives and how they live. So already it's a very applicable area of dealing with the built environment and built space. And that's why I like to look at it for something especially so close to architecture like level design. So last week we talked about a concept of design thinking, which, if you missed it, is synthesizing disparate bodies of knowledge into a single product or solution. So not only the idea of putting something, like making something, but also thinking about how that something is going to, take into account ideas from many different disciplines and then turn it into one thing. So it's kind of taking many and turning it into one. And I also talked about this quote, which is a quote from one of my architecture professors, where he said, "My favorite thing about being an architect is that if I'm doing, for example, a hospital project, I get to learn about the doctors and what they do during their day and how to make it easier. And that's always really sat with me because it is, something that's really important in design. Is you're not just making a thing, you're making a thing, or at least in game design, you're making a thing for somebody to use. And shouldn't that thing that they're using be both easy to use, but also have some like added benefit for using it? And so let's consider then this, the role of the game designer from Tracy Fullerton in her book Game Design Workshop. The role of the game designer is, first and foremost, to be an advocate for the player. The designer must look at the world of games through the player's eyes. So, like the architect looks at the doctor or the nurse and says, well, what hospital layout will make the life of the doctor or the nurse better and easier? We too can look at our games and say, and our levels in our games and say to ourselves, what layout of things in our levels would make this game better and more usable to the player? And when I say usable, I don't mean easy, but I mean like, how does the level not actively get in the way so that, like the player gets lost artificially and then it breaks up the flow of gameplay. So Stanford, I talked last week about design thinking becoming kind of a buzzword, and a lot of that's because of the work of Stanford University. But one thing that is kind of neat within their system is that they look at a key part of design thinking is empathizing and empathy. And empathy is, of course, the ability to understand another person's experiences and kind of get into their head a bit. And that's really important for, as we saw the quotes about being an architect and being a game designer, it's important for those fields to be able to get into the user's head and think, how can I make this thing for them? Okay. So then, again, let's look at some quotes from the previous level design lecture. Think about this. Level design is where the rubber hits the road. And then level designer is largely responsible for the implementation of the gameplay in a title. And then, of course, let's think about level design, the definition, the thoughtful execution of gameplay into game space for players to dwell in. Last time we talked about those quotes, we talked about definitions of level design and looked at how these definitions from people who've done this before are not only just saying like, oh yeah, it's you build stuff in a level editor and it's level design. Nobody says anything about tools necessarily, but what they say is they're talking about how the actual like interactions of the game are put into the space, and how that's where like the meaning occurs, and that's where it's really like you're directly delivering content to the player. And again, if we go here, primary means of communicating with the player. So all of these definitions are really focused on the idea of, how do we help the player? How do we build space that helps the player? And what does that even mean for a particular game? And I'm going to get a little deeper into some theory here, but I promise it'll come back up for air soon here, in a second. If we look at this chart, not by Vitruvius, this is again from McMansion Hell, but the architect Vitruvius, Roman architect Vitruvius, who was alive during the 1st century BCE, created this triad to describe what a building must have. So he said buildings should have firmitas, or firmness, which is they have to stand up. Utilitas, which is functional adequacy or usefulness. So basically, it had to be useful. Is it a house? Is it a shop? Is it, it has to have some sort of function. But then there's this venustas, which is aesthetic beauty. Now, a lot of people would say, well, there's lots of buildings that aren't beautiful. Well, of course there are, and they suck. But there are lots of buildings who are not only stand up and are useful, but also that have some sort of aesthetic element that makes us consider them great pieces of design. If we look at level design, we should have the same guidelines. So we should look at like what are the functional requirements. It has to work. So it has to fit on the console, or it has to run on the thing that we were trying to run the game on. If you're playing a Nintendo Switch game and it has one of those things where it comes on the card, but then it requires like 20 gigabytes of download in addition, is that really functional on the Nintendo Switch, or did they just kind of like stuff it into the Nintendo Switch? And I have plenty of games like that, but those are always, that does go into my purchasing decision sometimes. Same thing with like if you ever make a mobile game, it has to fit. It's not all hard drive space, but it's what are the technical requirements of the console or the thing you're launching to. So it has to work, and it has to be doable within the parameters of the engine you're using. But then there's usability, which, okay, fine, it works, but can the player use it very well? I mean, there's lots of things that work but are kind of janky and broken. Functional requirements, I guess, would be without glitches. But even without glitches, something, the level design might get you lost, or it might, there might not be, the game might be a little too hard or have a weird difficulty curve. So when you design, you want the software to be usable. You want its interface to be clear. You want the navigation to be clear of your levels. You want a person to be able to navigate and access stuff, the content within your game. Again, this isn't difficulty, but it is like, and I realize I just said difficulty curve. It's not that the game has to be easy. It's that the game's challenge should make sense. It should not kill you right away in the first level. If it's like a long slog RPG, right? If it's a little game like Super Polygon or Super Hexagon, that can kill you within a few seconds because it's mainly an arcade-ish title. But something that is like a bigger adventure shouldn't just destroy you outright. That's when people would like give up on the game. So levels in games should be usable. They should be navigable, and they're the way that you play them should make sense. But again, that's still not memorable. I've played lots of very mediocre games that are fine, but I don't think of like fondly necessarily years later. It's those ones that create delight. And it doesn't always have to be fun. It can be lots of different types of emotional reactions. But games should make you feel awesome. They should make you feel emotions. I got a question in the chat that says, so game feel would fit under this category. Absolutely. A game that there's a video by Mark Brown, Game Maker's Toolkit, where he talks about game feel, and he shows a video of a shooter, like a kind of Mega Man-esque game that's on mobile, or maybe it's not on mobile. The one I'm thinking of is called Mutant Mudds, which is fine, but I don't particularly think it's great. And I played that on mobile, but it did not have great game feel, and neither did the game that Mark Brown was showing off. So it was usable, it functioned, but it didn't delight. It didn't have this third element, which is really the sort of secret sauce that makes great games great. Again, how do we do this within level design? So yes, game feel would absolutely fit in this. And actually, I lost my train of thought. But some of what we're going to discuss today, if we look at it through the lens of game feel, is almost level design game feel, even though you're not necessarily doing it with like screen shake and particle effects, right? So let's talk about how to build those usable and emotional game spaces. Because again, learning the software and learning which buttons to press, very tiny part of the equation. We want to create great art. And how do we do that? So first, let's talk about some things that lead to usability. So online, you'll see lots of this, jokes about modern level design, how they don't offer a lot of choice. So choice is a really important thing, first of all. even like a little choice, even like, how do you approach an enemy from one direction or another? Do you approach them from like the high pass, or do you kind of get into the trenches, and have multiple choices of how to approach one puzzle? Even that can feel more satisfying than just straight on, only one way. So, it allows players to feel like they have what's called agency, which, they control their destiny. They control the input that they have matters. So, we can find useful metaphors for this in classical types of game spaces. A maze, for example, is a navigation puzzle where players have multiple choices of how to proceed. Now, most mazes have only one solution, but if we think of mazes more in a metaphorical sense, a game may not, or a level may not be a literal maze, but the idea that there's lots and lots of different types of pathways and choices through a game, as opposed to just one direct path, is better than, again, a hallway path. And think about what we talked about with, the Final Fantasy series. Final Fantasy VII is kind of like a classical maze in that, there's one solution. It's not like there's multiple endings to Final Fantasy VII, but there's lots of little divergent paths that you can go down. The difference between Final Fantasy VII and like a maze in an activity book is that there's often cool stuff at the end of those divergent paths. So that gives you a lot of feeling of agency. So question, do you think a game can have too many paths or give the player too many choices? No, I do not. That's kind of the holy grail of like procedural generation, actually, is let's give the player infinite choice, right? So no, I don't think that there can be too many choices. I think it kind of depends on your artistic goals, because maybe like, and I'm not saying that Final Fantasy VII having one ending is a bad thing. I love Final Fantasy VII. I'm super excited for the remake now. That I've read some reviews today and they say it's amazing. But I think that that is a game that had a goal. The developers had a goal. It's like, we are going to tell this story. And that's okay. Like, sometimes you want to tell this story. And, they did a good job of balancing it with, other distractions, like good distractions, meaningful distractions, where if you want to go collect all of the summons, go and do it. And that's a wonderful stuff, and then it adds to your satisfaction in the main story. So, excellent question. I think they cannot have too many. The only too many is like if you overscope on your team. Make sure that your team can handle all that content. But I think it can be good to have, like, even if you have one ending, multiple paths. Question: does this only apply to games that have a narrative? Stuff like sports games and fighting games only have win and lose. So sports games, they have, one, we're talking about level design mainly. So I don't want to get into like too general of games, but in terms of sports games, they have win and lose, but they are very open in the idea that, consider baseball. Consider listening to a baseball game, and you'll hear somebody do something where you'll hear some stat thrown out like, that hasn't happened since 1937. And, all of those abilities for a game to go in these like weirdly divergent ways is very non-linear. So even though there's win or lose at the end of a like match of something, you get lots of divergent outcomes because of the nature of the rules of sports. And then yes, strategy is a choice. So yes, like, and again, we're getting outside the realm of levels now, but in terms of like a metaphysical sense of games, a game that offers a rich possibility space of strategy also is like metaphorically maze-like. All right, so I got to get back on track here, but yes, mazes can be literal, but they can also be like a metaphor for game structures. And it's important to know that, because then you can start to think about, again, taking it back to level design, even if your level has a beginning, middle, and end, what choices, what divergences do you allow players? And maybe just like a little side path is enough, but that can be incredibly meaningful. But that's not to say linear spaces are always bad. Here you have a classic labyrinth, which does not offer any branching paths. So if you trace this labyrinth with your finger, you will see that it hits all of these points and does not offer any choices. Now, you might be like, well, but people call mazes labyrinthian. Well, that's because they misuse the word labyrinth. That is not... Mazes are never labyrinthian. Labyrinths are labyrinthian. So know that labyrinths are actually a distinct thing. So why is that important? Because, again, we're talking about a different planning metaphor. If we think of games, again, as in a metaphysical sense, as a labyrinth, so returning to Final Fantasy VII or the Japanese role-playing game in general, a lot of those definitely have a story to tell. And they can be very, labyrinthian in that you have a beginning and an end, and then twists and turns in the middle that make that journey interesting, but ultimately you're going to one place. You can shoot... The difference is some games give you that illusion of choice, which makes it feel, again, metaphysically maze-like, a Final Fantasy VII, or they, put you in a literal hallway and you don't even see the... There is no illusion of choice whatsoever, like, again, in Final Fantasy XIII. But on the flip side, you can have a game like Dysphoria, which we looked at in this class, that offers no choices, but that's okay. The journey is the purpose. And again, in a classic labyrinth, it's a meditative act to be in a labyrinth like this, is that these people are traveling this, and it's a form of mindfulness. So, there's a time for a level that is purely linear, and that's okay. A Super Mario Brothers level is usually purely linear, and that's because it's an obstacle course. So, lots of great questions. Any questions before we move on from mazes and labyrinths? This is a big one, but I think it'll be good. Dysphoria doesn't have level design. You are wrong. It absolutely does have level design. In fact, I think that the I Feel Weird in My Body screen is one of the greatest expressions of level design that has ever been created. Because, there you have the idea of the level design being used as a metaphor. You have a gap in a wall, and you have an avatar that is a Tetris block shape, and the inability for the player character to function, like to navigate the level at all, then becomes a storytelling mechanism. So I think it's a wonderful expression of level design. And then thinking of Twine games though can be really great levels, because then you're dealing with essentially... Twines are almost like they're a flowchart, which are themselves a planning mechanism for levels. So, you may not be looking at a space, but, think of the game, The Uncle Who Worked at Nintendo, and that twine is structured like a house. And even though some of the threads are, mental, and you think about the history of the characters for a little while, some of the threads are like, I'm going to go use the bathroom now, and then you come back to the den. So it's laid out like a house. It just doesn't, its form of game is very different. I would call Zork, which is one of the great old text adventures, very, very level, very, maze-like and spatial, right? And Colossal Cave Adventure, one of the first text adventures, if not the first, was supposed to be basically text version of a cave that the designer explored with his kids. So, levels can exist not only in 3D space. They don't just have to be 3D space. And then there was would you say Mario is a maze while Sonic is a labyrinth? That's interesting. I would actually give Sonic credit of having more divergent paths. It's just that you hit them very fast, but generally there's like an upper, middle, lower in a Sonic game. Would I say Mario is more of a maze and offers more choice? It depends on the Mario game. Super Mario Brothers 1, actually no, Mario Brothers 1 has up and down. So Mario has always dealt with up and down, at least. But that diverging path is super important because, again, it makes you feel like the world is bigger, even if it is just like go down the pipe and go into a coin room or something like that. Okay, cool. Awesome discussions here. This is great. So, then of course, you have, somebody brings up, even in Mario 1, there are warp zones. Yes, that is true. There's another type, and this goes into some of the content that's in the book that I didn't really think we should get into, but there is another type of space called a rhizome, which is a space that is like every point is connected to everything else. It's a really hard concept to get your head around, but like the internet would be a rhizome, as would, like warp zones could be like a limited rhizome in that you have like some choices of where to skip to, but it offers more connection. And then, games where you have maybe like the zoom spell in Dragon Quest or anything where you have like a transportation spell that'll get you to some place really quickly. Those can be said to be Rhizomatic, which again, that's a more complex concept to get your head around, but it is useful to know about. So I'm going to move on. Then you have open world sandboxes, which are like the ultimate in player choice. So here's the plateau from Breath of the Wild, which I really like as an open environment because it's got all the good features of a good sandbox world, but it's also smaller. It's almost like a miniature sandbox within this like much bigger sandbox that is the entirety of Breath of the Wild. So it's this nice little set apart place, which I think is really wonderful. It gives you like sort of the preview of the entire game before you get the entire game. So if you're planning these ever, how do you make them so that they're not boring and empty while also make them easy to use? And again, so this is that difference between navigability and actual delight. There are probably plenty of boring game cities that, slap a navigation arrow to your next objective on the radar, on the map, on the mini map, and you're good to go, right? But what is it about a place like, Breath of the Wild's plateau, and lots of other Breath of the Wild, but this is just a nice chunk, that makes it so nice and navigable? So for that, I like to look at the classic architectural text, The Image of the City by Kevin Lynch. So Lynch was really interested in ways in which people perceived cities and navigated in them. He used 5 elements to describe, parts of cities that allowed people to navigate within. And if you look at, there's actually another great game design presentation / article called I Learned Everything I Know About Level Design from Disneyland. And if you look at Disneyland and Disney World, it has a lot of these components as well, which are paths, edges, districts, nodes, and landmarks. So what does that mean? So let's look at the plateau again. We're going to look at the map. Rather than being random, because I think a mistake that a lot of new level designers make when trying to take on big open spaces like this is they think like, oh, it's nature, it's random. I'm just going to plop some trees down. I'm going to plop some mountains down, and that's just nature. But you want to think of these as almost like cities. You are planning everything. Your brushes and your paints may be trees and mountains, but you're still doing the same thing that like an urban planner would do with buildings and plazas and things like that. So Breath of the Wild, first of all, has recognizable pathways, some that are literal trails and other just implied by environment art. So those guide the player, but then you also have to help guide the player, and this isn't all of them, but I just chose like 3 prominent ones. You have edges, so things that either keep the player out, so you might see like the edge in the river, or the edge that you can't cross, or the lake you can't cross, or the mountain that you can't climb yet. Those are edges that keep you out and direct your navigation in ways. But then this upper edge is a forest. Now, that doesn't stop you from going into the forest, but it does create a very different, like you have grassland on one side of this edge and then suddenly trees. And that is an edge between 2 distinct, not there yet. But that's an edge between 2 distinct zones, 2 distinct districts, which we're going to talk about in a second. And those districts, are very distinct from each other and have like, you recognize when you're in the forest versus when you're in like the marsh, for example. So edge can either be something that literally stops you, or it can be something that just marks a transition. Nodes are decision points. They are crossroads. They are places where you can see multiple pathways in front of you, and then you get to choose. You notice that the nodes here are very packed towards the center of this plateau, and that's really that makes that center area that occurs. So this big one right here, if you can see my mouse, is where you start the game. And that there are so many nodes so close shows that, this is really meant to be a place where, the game kind of shows you its cards as early as possible. So it gives you, it does a lot of lifting, the design of this plateau, to make you think, okay, where should I go? I can go anywhere. Giving you lots of information at one time so that you know where you're going. And what's helpful when you are at these nodes, and look, there's some nodes like right at the edges of these districts, but these districts marked in the green squares are visually distinct areas that, again, you can see from these node spaces. And, so you're almost, as you're looking around from one of these navigation points, you can say, do I want to go to the forest, or do I want to go to the mountain, or do I want to go to the marsh, or do I want to go to the ruins? And that's really awesome, is, the nodes allow you to see all the things around you, which then, all the distinct areas around you, which then let you say, I'm going to go this way. And, it makes it a very easy to use, navigable environment that nonetheless makes you feel like you have all the choices in the world. Because again, you do, or at least in the small amount of the world it gives you. And then some of these things are punctuated by the last bit, which are landmarks, which are highly visible. I'm using like dungeons, but also high points as landmarks. So from the nodes, as you're looking over this landscape and you're saying, do I want to go to the forest? Well, hey, look at that interesting thing at the end of the forest. Maybe that's something that I should go to. Or look at that structure on the top of the mountain. I bet that's something. So then you make the choice to climb the mountain and reach the dungeon that's at the top of the mountain. And you also notice that these are fairly, evenly spaced apart on this plateau. There's some around the edges. There's some around the center. And those are important because they give you goals to get to. You start from the landmark that is the beginning of the game. You already get some nodes once you emerge from that landmark, and it's fairly linear to get down from it. But you can see the Temple of Time, you can look up the mountain, you can see the forest. You're fairly high at the beginning of the game. And then you can see other areas, including like what will eventually become a tower. So, from your start in the center, you start reaching nodes, getting information very quickly as you navigate these paths, and then you can see visually distinct regions that allow you to say, okay, which way am I going to go? And then these obvious landmarks, because they're either tall or glowy, they give you distinct goals. But, then once you've done one, you can say, okay, well, now I'm going to go to this other one I saw because I made a mental note that there's a cool thing in the forest. But this is how spaces are navigable. This is how navigation becomes easy but also interesting when you pack these worlds with dense information. Are there any questions on that so far? I'm going to keep going, but I just wanted, I'll answer questions as they come in. All right, so one of the biggest, the way that we turn this navigability into actual enjoyment and delight is we kind of work the arrivals. And what I mean by that is arrivals, the experience of reaching an important gameplay space. And architect Louis Kahn talked about served space and service space. Served space is hierarchically important spaces. So in a house, it's like maybe the dining room or the living space or, something that is a main house function. Service spaces would be anything like that, maybe more of a kitchen that isn't necessarily a place where people hang out. Like now kitchens people hang out in, but, once upon a time, people didn't always hang out in the kitchen. So maybe that would be a service space, or hallways or things like that. In games, served spaces are where the action happens and where there might be a main gameplay beat or story beat. So maybe the den in The Uncle Who Works for Nintendo is a served space, right? Service spaces are anything that guides a player to that or somehow gives... maybe there's resources in a served space, or maybe it's just a hallway, but it's not necessarily the main space. The idea is, you're probably going to have players stay in served spaces, so maybe that's where, if you're making a multiplayer map, that's where you expect most of the players are going to gather and fight. But a served space might be just kind of a space that goes from the spawn point to that main space and kind of rushes people through. It's not that interesting. It's kind of narrow, and it's not as fun to, there isn't as much verticality in it, so it's not as fun to be in. So, I've marked out some served and service spaces. The served spaces are red on the map. So, and I might not be 100% correct here. I'm working mostly from memory of this map, but, the idea that you highlight, you put the more interesting gameplay in the served spaces and then just kind of rush the player through other spaces. So that's an important concept. So how do we make those served spaces interesting? I'm going to stop to see if anybody has any other questions. I'm going to keep going. I just want to make sure people are able to ask stuff. So let's talk about environment art. It's not just eye candy. And it's not always just added after a level's done. You want to think in environment art, even if you're at a company where our crossroads nodes often serve spaces. I've highlighted them. That's a great question. So you can think about your nodes two ways. So let's think in terms of a city, where if you go to a city and there's a crossroads of some sort, like Times Square. Times Square is a crossroads. And it's where several roads meet. And that is a served space. There are restaurants off of it. There are, very public there are big public advertisements there. It is treated as a space for parties and events. So that is a node that is a served space. But, the crossroad at in Breath of the Wild, some of them can be served spaces. Maybe there's a, you put a stable at one of them, or, you place something somewhere at a crossroads in a game. But sometimes they literally can just be a, where some paths are. Now, so you can think like, so those, if they're just paths, they're not important in environment art or having some other landmark to them, but an important reason to think of them as served spaces, even if they're not your Times Square, DuPont Circle, kind of like landmarky node, is that the your nodes are so important that you should think about getting the player to them. And I'm not going to pull up a video of it right now, but the beginning of Breath of the Wild is you wake up in a cave, you solve some puzzles that teach you the basics of the game. You come out of this cave, and you see Hyrule laid in front of you. And I'll show you a shot of that in a little bit because it helps me make another point later on in this lecture. But then you can go like really only to the right. And once you go to the right, you go down a little mountain pathway, and then you come to a crossroad where there's like an important character, and he's got a little camp. But it is an important early, like you see a temple in front of you, you see a forest to the left, and you see some like other stuff to the right. So that's a node, and that pathway takes you there, even if the crossroad is not, again, environment art rich and important, but it is an important part of the game because that is you saying, I can go that way, or that way. So, they are served even if they are visually subtle, I would say. Okay, so this is unrevived. So The Last of Us has periods of resupplying and spending of resources. Would resupply sections be service spaces? So resupply is interesting, and I'm not going to go into too much with it right now, but resupply should be thought of as reward spaces. Now, you can combine served and reward. So maybe fight big boss, and then you get the hallway or the pathway. Shouldn't even call it a hallway, that's too literal, but pathway to next thing. Maybe that pathway starts with some resupply stuff. Does that make sense? Because, your reward could literally be like a room with like medical kits in it, and then you leave. Or it can be both path and room with medical, like pathway with medical kits. So you can have both happening at one time. So nodes can be used for smaller gameplay beats, resupply small side story, or for big beats like Times Square. Yes, nodes are super important. You should always think of having them, even if they are not, again, big beats. They can be very subtle, but they are an important piece of your design language. And I'm using that phrase very specifically for reasons that you will see later. Great questions. Thank you, everybody. So again, environment art. Think in environment art. Think about how, environment art is going to communicate important gameplay ideas to your player, even when you're gray boxing. This is a gray box, but you have a big red crystal. And if you don't have the final crystal art, you can still start to think about, for your testing purposes, like, how do I make this thing stand out? And this is why I tell people, even try to put some of your lighting into some of your gray boxes, because lighting is an important part of helping people travel a pathway, like in BioShock Infinite. So at the beginning of BioShock Infinite, the player is led through this pathway, and it's linear, but it has each room in this pathway has like the opposite color of the room that came before it. So you kind of go, like, you keep going through like blue, violet, and yellow, orange spaces alternating. And what that does is it kind of keeps you moving. You're always going to go towards the color that's the most different. And then there are little side areas that, kind of hit, like, give you some extra money or give you extra supplies that are off to the side. So if you're in a blue violet room and you see a room that's more like red violet, it's very subtle, but it still gives you like a little side. It's not very long, but it'll give you like a little side room to go in and maybe get some, for people like me who love to pick apart environments and find all the extra goodies hidden around. Those little subtle color changes were enough to make me realize like there's something over there. And then again, the main path is is screaming out in yellow orange. So color and lighting are very important for guiding players. Control does the same thing with red of the hiss, guiding players through the mostly... Yep, exactly. Or think of... what's that game? The parkour game where like everything that you had to jump on was red. Mirror's Edge. Mirror's Edge did the same thing where it's like, white environment, red stuff. Portal did something similar, not so much with color contrast, but with like differences in texture. The textures started to mean things. White walls were where you could put portals. Black walls were where you could not put portals and things like that. Which brings us to texture. And this is an NES game, but think of this in terms of like textures in general. Your early areas are very forest-like. They're green. They imply the idea that this is like a nice wooded area that happens to have monsters. But then you start going into mountain areas with like scary trees, and eventually you delve into dungeons, which are very scary and have very powerful monsters. So going from I'm flirting with the hero's journey here, but like if you track it along the hero's journey, you can track progress by quality of texture, if that makes sense. So textures are good for guiding players, even if you're not always thinking in them during Greybox. You can still start to think about like what is the quality of your environment and how do you communicate that with color and shape and things like that. This is the eye I'm supposed to go. So now I'm going to give you a term here that I hope you'll find useful. It's called miniature garden, which is the idea of a small space such as a garden or a game level. Now, I know you might be thinking, but game levels can be very big in terms of my character. That's true, but we tend to them as though they're very small, like a little bonsai tree, right? Because they're miniature. They're in our computers. And if you think about it in that way, even though it can take you a long time when you're at the player scale to navigate a level, as we plan it, it is this thing that we can look down at from above. So it's like a little miniature garden. So I'm going to get to the question that just popped up in a second once I get through miniature garden. So where does this come from? Well, Shigeru Miyamoto has called his aesthetic and that of Hyrule as no, you can still ask. I saw it go away. You can still ask it. I'm just gonna like look at it later. I just saw that it popped up. So the miniature garden aesthetic is from Miyamoto, and as also described by Chaim Gingold, who worked on Spore with Will Wright, and it's the idea of like every world is a world, like every game space is a world in miniature. Not every game space, but ones that are like, ones that are trying to be worlds in miniature can be worlds in miniature. So maybe you are making a Last of Us type level, but if you're planning it, you are tending to it like it is this little, like it's a sprawling city with bad stuff in it, but you're tending to it like it is this little miniature version of that. So, what am I getting at though? So it comes from Japanese garden design. So here's the Cleveland shot from the Cleveland Botanical Garden by David Slauson, and you're like, okay, so what? It's a lawn with some rocks in it. Well, the idea of Japanese garden design is not so much that you're making a nice literal garden; it's that you are creating small landscapes that are representative of larger landscapes, and so when you look at a lawn like this, you are looking at a lawn in a literal sense, but you're also looking at a space where, imagine this grass as a long, lake or ocean of water. And suddenly, if you look at in that way, see the rock in the middle as cliffs on an island and the short shrubs as trees, and then the taller rock as a taller mountain on this island. So suddenly, if you can switch your mental frame into looking at it this way, suddenly you see that this space is much more interesting, and it becomes this like I said, miniature garden. It is a landscape in miniature. So if we look at game worlds as landscapes in miniature, again, if it's gritty urban or if it's, a sort of Miyamoto-esque Hyrule world, we can start to approach them like one would approach a Japanese garden design, where, the way that Japanese design works, or landscaping design works, is that you often treat the elements of your landscape as though they have, they point to each other, they reference each other. You'll hear people talk about, the forces. So here I have an illustration from the book where you have these rocks, these cliffs in a theoretical video game level, and they, point in certain ways, and they tend they add forces to your point of view. And if you're standing on a particular area, now keep in mind, I drew this in 2014. No, actually drew it in 2013. So, these rocks point in a certain direction. They direct your eye. That's what the forces are about. It's how things direct your eye. And then you have a horizontal plane, which is the landscape in front of you. And then in the distance, you have a vertical plane, which is, you can't see my hand, but you have a vertical plane, which is, in this case, Scary Mountain. I had just watched the, first trailer for a Hyperlight Drifter when I saw this, so that's why everything's all Hyperlight Driftery. And then around it, you might have some mountains that point up to the thing. So it's all about pointing the player's eye to the thing you want them to see with the environment art. And then again, we'll go Breath of the Wild. Here again is that point where you first encounter Hyrule. You've come out of the cave. You now see the world in front of you. And at this point, by the way, anybody who's played, remember you don't have the hang glider, so you can't just jump off the cliff. This is a very directed area, so you have to, take the mountain pass. But, look at this. Even in this shot, you see this cliff is skewed in a certain way that it directs your eye in a certain direction. This, cliff down here does the same thing. There's some environment art that does this down here, and then you have landmarks in the background. You have Death Mountain, you have Hyrule Castle, and you have, I think, the Zora Realm there. But these guide your view towards these landmarks, and then even on the landmarks themselves, there's cliffs around these landmarks and pylons in the case of Hyrule Castle, which kind of continue to direct your eye up to the landmarks. So, they are using environment art to direct your gaze and make you see things, from these carefully planned vantage points. You will look from this cliff because it is the only place you can go at the beginning of the game. So having those vantage points can be really good for communicating to the player, what the world is about. And helping guide players even in these this doesn't have to be open. You can do this in closed environment or smaller environments. Last of Us does a really remarkable job of if it wants you to look at something, it'll have a fallen telephone pole that kind of points up at it, right? It does that sort of thing. Also, and that's not an open world game. It's a much more directed experience. So environment art is really useful in that way, and it can help you do some cool things with approaches and guiding the player's eye. So again, please keep questions coming. Love them. They're making this a better lecture, a better video. All right, so I'm going to try to drill through some of these last things quickly here. So contrast. Here we have narrow space that is gives you limited mobility based on your player's movement capabilities. You have intimate space, space that is very friendly to your player character's mobility. And then you have prospect space where it's just big and open, it's you and the enemy. And those three are very important because they can be used and contrasted in interesting ways. like Prospect and Refuge, which is a thing you should know about in level design, which is a spatial contrast between intimately scaled, i.e. stuff that's friendly to your player's movement, so a nice space, a refuge space, scaled areas of safety, and danger, and the contrast is against dangerous areas, prospect spaces, which are where you are open to attack. Now, these can come in some different flavors. So this is like a prospect and refuge that deals with more like narrow versus prospect. So like you can't really move around in The Last of Us when you're up against, taking cover, right? You're limited in mobility behind cover. So that's more narrow to prospect. But if we look at the Court of the Lions in the Alhambra, which is in Granada, Spain, this is more intimately scaled. This is like you are under this nicely scaled colonnade, in some shadows. So like, this is obviously not a dangerous place, but if you wanted to remain hidden or kind of people watch, you could do so from behind these columns and watch people who are wandering around in the courtyard. So this is like a more nice, friendly prospect refuge, but it's one that still offers you some like hiding space. So that's one way that you can create interesting, you can use contrasted in an interesting way. Is smaller spaces to larger spaces. Now, again, prospect and refuge is one of the ways that plays out. But it can also play out in being rewarding. So there was a question before about reward, like where you get items and things. And we're going to still go over that in a second. But sometimes large space can be a reward. Sometimes it's not always dangerous. Valve has this concept that it calls rewarding vista. And one of my favorite ones is in Half-Life 2 Episode 2. You go through the antlion den, which are like these bug monsters. So you're basically in an ant tunnel. And you come out the end of it and you see this valley with pine trees and mountains and a bridge in the distance. Now the bridge has like enemy soldiers coming across it trying to blow up your base. So then it creates story tension, but it is a moment to pause. Your player can pause after an action section of the game. You get the reward of narrative. You get the reward of a scene of acting, and you can just stop for a second. And that's its own kind of reward as well. So question was, in Batman Arkham games, are the gargoyles refuge spaces then? Yes, that is an excellent example. And in fact, let me go back. So for this slide, I had Batman Arkham Asylum, and then I switched it out because I was like, no, that's too much grimdark before suddenly 8-bit Mega Man. So I wanted to put something kind of in between, and that's why I chose Mario 64. But yes, the environments in the Arkham games are, I would call them intimate space, because everything in those is based on Batman's movement metrics and not on the enemy's movement metrics. And that's why the developers called that Predator gameplay instead of stealth gameplay, because in stealth, you're at the disadvantage because everything's kind of like tension against your movement metrics. So like Metal Gear Solid, it's testing you all the time. In Arkham games, everything is for Batman. It's designed for Batman. So you're in the driver's seat of that game. So everything, yes, gargoyles are refuges. Everything is intimate space. There's very few times in those games where you're in a prospect, because you're actually the enemies are in a prospect. You are the predator in that case. Halo does that at the beginning of Crash Landing on Requiem. Yes, indeed. It's actually been years since I played Halo 4. Okay, so, yep, so not prospect and refuge, but like narrow to wide, becoming a sort of like relief and a reward. So that's another thing you can do, is this sort of like dark to light. This is also has an element of like dark to light. High to low. is another contrast that's really nice. You know, a lot of really great first-person shooter maps are the sort of struggle to get to the high vantage point. So here's the boardwalk map from Halo 3, or is it Reach? I can't remember. But this is an awesome map, and it functions so well because it has ramps, it has vantage points, and it has this contrast between high and low. You either have refuge. Okay, thank you, Reach. I loved Reach. That's one of my favorite Halo games. But you have, where is it? Okay, there's my mouse. If you can see my mouse, there's a refuge. You can have refuges down below here where you can use them as like cover. But oops, no, stop. Go. But at the same time, if you gain access of these higher areas, then you run the prospect, and have mastery of the map. By far the most strategy-filled, riddled map. It's a good map. Okay, shadow. Not just a hedgehog. Darkness created when light is blocked. So why does that matter? Well, shadow is important because... Sorry, I had to scratch my nose. Shadow is important because humans like to go from darkness to light. We are afraid when we go from light into darkness. So that switch is really important and creates really interesting emotional experiences. So, again, Half-Life 2's Ravenholm does this a lot. You go between dark and light a lot, and you're trying to avoid the dark because that's like sort of survival horror with head crabs, right? So this contrast between these two things are really important. You can use shadow and light. Like if you're in shadow, you can use light as a way to direct player towards where you want them to go. And then you can have the need to descend into shadow as a way to create like interesting, tense gameplay scenes. Shade, on the other hand, which is a lighting condition between light and dark caused by diffused light, like this in Sagrada Familia by Antonio Gaudi, which is still in construction and has been since 1882. It's planned to be done in 2026. This is a really cool structure. It was impossible to actually create some of the structure until modern... that was planned until modern construction technology was created. But this is an example of like using lots of diffused light to create this sort of like ethereal feeling. So why is this important? Well, this sort of lighting condition creates curiosity. So it's not quite menacing. It's not quite nice. So you could go into a big space that has like a big like epic sort of space with a shaded condition, and you could be like, well, maybe I'm about to get something amazing. Maybe I'm about to get some sort of mystical weapon. And I realize he's using the mystical weapon in this shot, but or what happens if I walk into this shaded space, this brightly lit but kind of like hazy space, and it's actually a trap and something's about to attack me. So that creates what's called atmospheric ambiguity. Shade's really great for that. So lots of lighting. Moral of this story, do lots of lighting. All right. Any questions? I'm going to keep going, but I am paying attention to the chat. Thank you for all the questions so far. So to finally address rewards, usually think of rewards as like that thing that, again, when you have a boss fight and then you go into the next room and there's health, right? SGI comes with tech demos. There are nothing but 3D environments with lighting, advanced shadows, and do nothing but get out the feeling. Yes, somebody remarks that, some of the tech demos for like certain tools are like basically 3D environments with lots of these types of things. Atmospheric ambiguity is, again, this is a perfect example of it's not just about the tool, right? Like, yes, the technology allows us to get to the lighting conditions that create these emotional experiences, but unless you understand that the emotional experience can be created, you're really just kind of like, shooting a bazooka with no target in mind. So yeah, like having tons of power is great, but you want to do it knowing what that power can help you make. So that's again, if you think back to the Vitruvian triad of level design, it's a lot about, it's not just about the tool. The tool helps us reach that thing that becomes delight, or the emotional payoff. So again, rewards, you think of it as the thing where it's like, let me get a bunch of health packs after a boss fight, right? Or let me, if the game is about like if it's a Metroidvania, maybe there's rewards that help you, expand your abilities. Maybe that comes after some sort of big struggle, right? So that's kind of like the easy one to know. But let's also think about reward spaces. It could be any space in a game that gives a player positive reinforcement of any kind. So we talked about, the health pack, the upgrade. But remember that, again, in classical architecture, sometimes this reward was created by like, here's San Miniato al Monte in Florence, long staircase. And in fact, like the sequence going up to this church is far longer than this shot even. But you climb up to the church, and then the church is a healing meditative space. And I'm not saying that, if that's not how you feel about churches, that's not what I'm trying to hint at. I mainly mean in terms of like the architectural function of that space, right? But if we return to the Half-Life 2, you have like this narrow, dark, and you're starting to see how all these things are coming together and forming this language, right? Narrow, dark, oppressive, difficult, lots of bugs and things to fight, and it's just like really, action-packed, difficult, tense area of a game. You come out into this light, there's this gorgeous view, there's natural materials. Like, we didn't even get into the pleasantness, a little bit of materiality, but like sometimes it's nice, like humans tend to like natural materials, stone and wood and things like that. So you come out, natural materials, natural light, blue, green, colors, and you get to just pause. And sometimes that pause is the reward as well. Like, yes, you can have health pack and pause, and sometimes that reward space is the hallway that goes to the next place. This is a good example, because like you stop at this porch, and the porch is like, because it's a porch, it's its own little space. You pause, you see the story scene where they're like, oh no, the Combine are marching on our base. And then you just like leave the porch, and now you're in the transition space to the next climax, right? So, it's both transition space, it's like reward space, main story beat, and then quickly transition space, because you've set the reward scene apart by having it be on like a little porch, even though it's not totally enclosed, if that makes sense. So, you can do all these little architect-y, interior designy space tricks. It's the same kind of thing where like if you put a carpet under a specific piece of furniture, that makes that a different space from the rest of the room. That's kind of what they're doing here. But, this is your payoff. It's a payoff in giving you a break. Exiting the sewers into a green, hilly suburb at the end of Pittsburgh in The Last of Us was such a wonderful reward. Exactly. So, when you do get that sort of like sudden pleasantness, it's really nice. That's actually why I found Dead Space 2 to be really exhausting to play, because you'd get through like just a grind of enemies, and then suddenly you get to a point where you're like, oh, cutscene, thank gosh. Oh, thank God. Okay. I'm going to sit back. No, I'm not. Okay. I'm getting sucked out a window. All right. This is bad. The game never gave you a break, and I found myself like stopping playing because I was just emotionally exhausted. Contrast that with like Animal Crossing right now, where I can play. I have to like force myself to go to bed because I'm tending to my Japanese garden. In which, yes, I am using all of these spatial design principles. So, but it's some games like almost exhaust you by not giving you that repose. And then the last thing, and again, questions, please keep them going. I'm going to continue going because I recognize the lag between. I don't want to do any dead air. So patterns. So what are patterns? Well, like I've said in the past, patterns are any time you watch a talk on game design, you're watching a talk on patterns. Because what a pattern is it's a method that somebody comes up with in design to solve a problem. So, Matt Thorson says, okay, how am I going to do this within Celeste? And then he arrives at a design solution, and then that becomes something that is likely repeated, and then that repetition makes it a pattern. So, we discovered that players liked to do this when we were playtesting Hitman, and we decided that we liked it so much and it was so successful that we put it in this level, this level, this level. That's a pattern. When you have enough patterns for your game, when you solve enough problems and start to come up with like lots of little level design tricks for your game, and I keep saying for your game because every game is different, so your pattern language for every game is going to be different, but once you have enough patterns, it's going to become a pattern language. Now, pattern language is, I'm going to go on the like broad definition, but it's like a folk system of solutions to common and culturally recognized design problems. So, I say folk solutions and try to reach into the past because pattern languages are, every time you see like a culture have a specific type of architecture or building, that is because that culture has come up with its own set of patterns for how to address, their environment or their, the needs of their culture for built spaces or something like that. So they start to develop a language that is distinctly theirs. Hitman's great at this. You can jump, so from the comment section, you can jump into a new level and know, okay, there should be a body dump here or a weapon hidden there. Yes, games are really good at that. And yeah, like, that's why I said Hitman, because like Hitman's great at it, Half-Life's great at it, Dishonored's great at it. And what they do is they develop this language that like almost the player begins to read, and then it becomes like an awareness of that's where that conversation comes in. Like the developer creates their pattern language to solve design problems, but then they make it readable to the player, and then that becomes the design conversation. And that's when the player starts to see that and is like, what's down that hallway, or what's down this like little hidden alcove, and then they find something, then they feel good. And that's where the delight happens. So you're starting to get it. Like, you're getting it. Yes. So patterns are really great in that way. And like I said, they're different for different games. But where does this all come from? So it comes from this trilogy of books by this architect, Christopher Alexander. And basically what it amounts to is study the context for which you are building. This should start to sound familiar from the beginning of this lecture. It's like I planned it this way. Design for the context and the people that you're, plan for, learn about their needs, learn about what they want, plan for their way of living, and then design to that. So the idea is that he created this book of theory called The Timeless Way of Building, and it describes this like element of architecture that he couldn't define at the time. He defined in his later works, but he called like life. Like, what does it mean when a building has life? And that turned into this thing called the pattern language, which was, here are patterns that have existed across cultures that lead to this living feeling in the architecture. And then he had the Oregon experiment, where he planned out the campus of the University of Oregon, And according to these patterns and according to the patterns that he recognized that the people who were working there needed. So this was his sort of use of this language that he developed in making a college campus in this case. So where does that matter in game design? Well, we talked a lot. Everything we've talked about in this lecture is a pattern. Shade is a pattern. The way you approach shade is a pattern. The way you use lighting and contrasting. You could have a pattern that is the pattern of contrasting color schemes. And the first part, like the area in BioShock Infinite where you go from like blue to orange to blue to orange, that is evidence of that pattern. The pattern of Prospect and Refuge is a pattern. And like, because that in many games, Prospect and Refuge makes a certain type of spatial movement for the player that is meaningful and matters in the game. So these are all patterns. And why are they important? And why should you think about your design as patterns? Well, I used this example before, but I'm going to use it again. So, in the game Dead Man's Trail that I've been slowly chipping away at for years, we recognized that we wanted the player to explore nooks and crannies and alcoves and try to find stuff, like, loot. And, those blue squares, this is a shot from the engine, but those are loot spawners. And we wanted the player to look for this loot. But then in our playtesting, players would get stuck in a dead end, and then they'd be like, this game sucks, and then they'd walk away, and we didn't want that. So we decided that, we should eliminate all of the dead ends. So we eliminated all the dead ends. And what that did was it created the pattern of loops. So there was always a loop now. There was always a way out. And that loop existed on the same screen so that the player would always be aware that there was a way out. So like within the screenshot of an area, there should always be a recognizable way out. Now that doesn't mean that the player always got away, because they'd stay in an area too long and then they'd get crowded out from both entrances or both exits by zombies and then die. But in that case, they saw the exit, they recognized it was an exit, they recognized what the risk was, they chose to ignore it, and then they died, and they said, that was my fault. Okay, I lost that character, I'm going to keep playing though. So they didn't walk away, even though they had failed, because they saw that they had just made a bad calculation. But that loop, that pattern of loops, became really important for our level design. And maybe it's not right for every game, but it's right for a lot of games. You could also say, like in a platformer, a good pattern might be the pattern of indicating pickups. So maybe like if I'm making my Mario Maker level, I put a trail of coins where I want the player to jump, so that even if the next platform is outside of the screenshot, it hints to the player, please jump, or else you're going to fall into the pit and die unfairly. So maybe that's a pattern that's repeatable, or the pattern of a reward space after an obstacle part, or again the pattern of shade and shadow, or just shadow in this case. The point is, for these, you want to test, you want to check with your players, and you want to look at your play tests and really see what the players are getting right, what they're struggling with, what they're having an easy time with, and what they enjoy, especially what they enjoy, and what's going to help them have the most satisfying emotional experience possible. See the things that lead to those satisfying emotional experiences and then highlight them in your testing. Again, like I did with the loops, like Valve did when they discovered that because of their physics system, somebody could pick up a red barrel and chuck it at an enemy and make the enemy swallow, like a monster swallow the red barrel, and then it exploded. They didn't plan on that. They saw it in playtesting. They saw how happy the person was, and then they put it all over the place. So that's how patterns work, is you come up with an issue or the problem that you're trying to solve in your level, You check it during playtesting, you see what the reaction is, and then you start to, make it part of your language and how you make your game. Because really, and I'm going to leave with this quote from architect Louis Kahn, who's one of my favorite architects, and it's going to sound like I'm crazy, but give me a second here. You say to a brick, "What do you want, brick?" And brick says to you, "I like an arch." And you say to brick, "Look, I want one too, but arches are expensive, and I can use a concrete lintel. What do you think of that, brick?" And then brick says, "I like an arch." Well, what the heck do I mean by that? Well, so what he's talking about is how do you design, if you're using bricks, when you're building with bricks, build your building to do what bricks are good at. Don't build your building with brick if you don't want to do what bricks are good at. Build it with something else. So, when we design for games, it's a lesson in listening to your material, listening into your the things that make up what you're building or what you're designing. Well, we design with technology and user emotion. So, and we design with experiences. So how do we design levels that showcase our game's mechanics the best way possible? How do we take the interactivity we've created and make environments that are going to accentuate that interactivity? So, we want to do right by our game mechanics. We want to build the level that makes the cool game mechanic that we create even cooler. And then finally, how do we make game worlds that support our players? We are the advocates of the players. We are there to make their gameplay lives easier. So how do we build gameplay worlds that do right by the player? We listen to the player. We pay attention to what they're responding well to. We try to create something that they want to be a part of for a long time and not just kind of try and dismiss. And that goes into understanding what they respond to, how humans deal with space, and how humans are going to find space pleasing, or in our case, we get to find out what they like or what they find unpleasing, but use that to create cool emotional experiences that involve tension and fear, as long as we draw them out of it. So, this is what I mean by it's not just about the technology. You've got to think about the player. You've got to think about the sequence of spaces. You've got to think about the artistry of this, because this is where the rubber hits the road. This is the person who they are the master of all of these things, and they have to put them into the final design and implement the gameplay in the title. And if you understand these things, then yes, you can be a level designer. Like I said, this isn't everything I've ever written down. This is just some useful tidbits that I immediately came to mind. So, I hope you enjoyed it, and thanks for listening. All right. Any questions? My voice is very hoarse right now, and I forgot to bring my water bottle up. Somebody typed clap. Okay, so if there's no follow-up questions, what I'm going to do is for again, those of you who are in my class, because I got to acknowledge that this video might be watched in the future, but I will, be around on our class Discord. I might have some later, need to process, hit you up on Twitter. Okay, cool. So yeah, feel free to comment or send Discord or Twitter, but I will see you all later.